There is a stretch of genetic code inside your body that does not come from your mother or your father or any human being in your family line. It comes from someone who died around 50,000 years ago. Someone with a heavy brow and a wide chest who hunted in the cold of Ice Age Eurasia, who was not, by the old definitions, one of us at all. For most of the last century, the official story said this was impossible. It said our species rose alone, replaced everyone who came before, and stood as the single surviving branch of humanity. The evidence now says something the textbooks resisted for decades. We were never alone, and the proof was written the entire time in the DNA of nearly everyone alive outside of Africa. That is the contradiction this investigation reopens. For generations, the dominant model of human origins was clean and final. Modern humans evolved in Africa, spread outward, and the older kinds of human they encountered, above all the Neanderthals, simply vanished, outcompeted and erased. No mixing, no shared children, a replacement, total and one-directional. It was a satisfying story because it was simple. It gave our species a clear edge and a clean victory. But a simple story is not the same as a true one. And the trouble with this one is that it required a specific belief repeated with confidence for years that turned out to be wrong. To see why this matters, you have to understand what was actually being claimed. The question underneath all of it is the most personal question a species can ask. Are we the pure end of a single line, or are we a blend, carrying the genes of people we were taught had nothing to do with us? For most of the 20th century, the answer was certainty itself. The Neanderthals were a dead end, a separate creature that lost, and anyone who suggested our ancestors had children with them was, for a long time, working against the consensus of the field. So how did that certainty form? And who built it? The first hard genetic evidence seemed only to confirm the wall between us. In 1997, a team that included the geneticist Matthias Krings and the pioneering scientist Svante Pääbo, then working in Munich, achieved something extraordinary. They extracted mitochondrial DNA, the small loop of genetic code passed only from mother to child, from the original Neanderthal-type specimen, the bones found in Germany's Neander Valley in the 19th century. It was one of the first times anyone had read genetic material from an extinct human relative. And the result, published in the journal Cell, drew a sharp line. The Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA fell far outside the range of all living humans. It suggested the two lineages had been separated for hundreds of thousands of years, with no sign that Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA had leaked into the modern gene pool at all. For more than a decade, that finding hardened into doctrine. Study after study through the late 1990s and 2000s examined Neanderthal mitochondrial sequences, and they kept landing in the same place, outside us, distinct from us. Researchers surveyed thousands of living human mitochondrial sequences and found none that looked Neanderthal. The conclusion seemed unavoidable. There had been no interbreeding, or at most, so little it left no trace. The replacement model had its proof. The Neanderthals were a separate species that came, lived and died without joining our story. But here is the open loop that should have stayed open longer than it did. Mitochondrial DNA is only one tiny slice of the genome, and it is inherited through one single line, mother to mother to mother. It can vanish in a few generations through nothing more than chance. A population could carry substantial ancestry from another group and still, by the luck of inheritance, lose every trace of that group's mitochondrial DNA. The early researchers knew this. A few critics said it openly. The absence of Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA in living people did not actually prove the absence of Neanderthal ancestry. It only proved the absence of one fragile, narrow signal. And yet the broader conclusion, no interbreeding, took hold anyway, because it fit the story the field already preferred. There was a clue pointing the other way, and the field largely set it aside. In 1998, in Portugal, an archaeologist named João Zilhão and his colleagues excavated the burial of a young child at a rock shelter called Lagar Velho. The skeleton was strange. It had the body proportions and certain features that looked like a blend, the build of a Neanderthal mixed with the anatomy of a modern human. Zilhão and the anatomist Eric Trinkaus argued it might be a hybrid, evidence that the two kinds of people had not just met, but had children together. The reaction from much of the field was skeptical, even dismissive. Critics argued the bones were simply a stocky modern child, that the proportions meant nothing, that you could not read interbreeding off a skeleton. With no DNA recoverable from the remains, the hybrid claim could not be confirmed, so it was filed under disputed, and the replacement model rolled on. Notice what is happening here. This is not a story of villains hiding the truth. The scientists who built the no interbreeding consensus were careful, brilliant people working with the best evidence they had. The mitochondrial signal genuinely did point away from mixing. The skeletal evidence genuinely was ambiguous. The problem was not fraud. The problem was that a limited kind of evidence, read through the expectations of the time, was allowed to settle a question it was never powerful enough to settle. The wall between us and the Neanderthals was built honestly. It was just built on the wrong foundation, and it would take a completely different kind of evidence to bring it down. Until now, this looks like ordinary science, a reasonable conclusion drawn from the available data that simply turned out to be incomplete, a mistake of limitation, not intent. But then the record changes, because the same researcher whose early work had helped draw the line between us and the Neanderthals refused to stop there. Svante Pääbo had spent his career chasing a goal most scientists thought was impossible. Not the small mitochondrial loop, but the entire Neanderthal nuclear genome, the full genetic blueprint, the part that is inherited from both parents and that records the deep truth of ancestry that mitochondrial DNA alone could never reveal. This was a staggering technical problem. Ancient DNA is shattered into tiny fragments, chemically damaged and overwhelmingly contaminated, both by the bacteria that colonized the bones over tens of thousands of years and, far more dangerously, by the DNA of the modern humans who excavated and handled them. To read a Neanderthal genome, Pääbo's team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig had to develop ways to pull genuine ancient sequences out of that sea of contamination and prove they were real. They worked primarily with bones from Vindija Cave in Croatia, building the genome fragment by fragment from material most scientists had written off as unreadable. In May 2010, the team, with Richard Green as the lead author, published a draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome in the journal Science. And buried in that achievement was a result that quietly detonated the replacement model. When they compared the Neanderthal genome to the genomes of living people from around the world, they found that people outside of Africa, Europeans and Asians, shared more genetic variants with Neanderthals than sub-Saharan Africans did. There was only one good explanation. After modern humans left Africa, they had interbred with Neanderthals, and the descendants of those unions carried Neanderthal DNA out across the rest of the world. The team estimated that non-Africans derive somewhere between 1% and 4% of their genomes from Neanderthals. Think about what that number means. The mitochondrial DNA had said no because the mitochondrial DNA had simply been lost, but the rest of the genome remembered. It had remembered for 50,000 years. The wall that the field had built was not a wall at all. It was a door that had been propped open the whole time, and almost everyone outside Africa had walked through it in their ancestry. The Neanderthals had not been replaced cleanly. They had been absorbed. And here is the question, that result, forced into the open, the question that would take another 14 years to answer with precision. If this happened, when did it happen? When exactly did our ancestors and the Neanderthals meet and mix, and for how long? The genome kept giving up secrets, and each one made the old story smaller. The mixing was not some trivial accident with no consequences. Researchers began finding that the Neanderthal DNA inside us does real work. Some of the inherited variants shaped the immune system, affecting how our ancestors fought off the unfamiliar diseases of a new continent. Others influenced skin and hair, metabolism, even the body's response to sunlight at northern latitudes. Some Neanderthal variants appear to have been beneficial, helping modern humans adapt quickly to environments the Neanderthals had already survived for hundreds of thousands of years. The vanished people had, in a sense, handed our ancestors a survival kit for Eurasia, written into the genome. Other inherited segments turned out to carry risk, including variants later linked to how some people's bodies respond to certain modern diseases. The inheritance was not symbolic, it was, and is, biologically alive. By now, the recognition of how profoundly this rewrote our origins was undeniable. In 2022, Svante Pääbo was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his work on the genomes of extinct humans and human evolution. The man whose early mitochondrial work had helped draw the line between us and the Neanderthals had by the end erased it and been honored for proving that the line was never really there. But even then, one piece of the puzzle remained frustratingly blurry. Everyone now agreed the interbreeding had happened. What no one could pin down was exactly when and whether it was a single encounter or many scattered across tens of thousands of years. This was not a minor footnote. The timing of the mixing is a clock for the whole human journey out of Africa. If you know when modern humans were exchanging genes with Neanderthals, you know roughly when they arrived in the lands the Neanderthals held, which constrains the entire map of how our species spread across the planet. For years, the estimates were broad, drawn from single ancient individuals or from the statistics of living genomes, and they scattered across a wide window. Some methods could not even distinguish a brief, intense encounter from a slow trickle of mixing that lasted hundreds of generations. The signal was real, but its edges were soft. The proof of when was still missing. And the way that final proof arrived is the part of this story that feels almost impossibly precise. It came in December 2024. In two studies published on the same day, one in the journal Nature and one in the journal Science, that together closed the loop the field had been chasing since 2010. The first came from a team analyzing some of the oldest modern human genomes ever sequenced. Working with roughly 45,000-year-old human remains from a site called Ranis in Germany and a famous early skull known as Zlatý kůň from Czechia, the researchers, in a study led by Arev Suma with Johannes Krause and colleagues at the Max Planck Institute, did something earlier scientists could only dream of. They read the genomes of people who lived close to the time of the mixing itself. And in those ancient genomes, the Neanderthal DNA came in long, unbroken segments, because not enough generations had passed to chop it into the small fragments seen in living people. The length of those segments is a molecular stopwatch. By measuring them, the team could date the admixture directly. Their conclusion was that the Neanderthal ancestry in these early Europeans came from a single shared event, common to essentially all non-Africans, that occurred somewhere around 45 to 49,000 years ago. The second study, led by Leonardo Iasi, Manjusha Chintalapati and their colleagues, attacked the same question from the other direction. They assembled a catalogue of Neanderthal ancestry segments across more than 300 genomes, 58 of them ancient individuals stretching back tens of thousands of years, and the rest present-day people from around the world. Nobody had ever modeled all of these together before, and when they did, the timing sharpened to a point. The main period of Neanderthal gene flow centered on roughly 47,000 years ago. More than that, they could finally estimate its duration. The mixing was not a single night and not a 100,000-year smear. It was a sustained but bounded period, beginning around 50,500 years ago and lasting on the order of 7,000 years until the Neanderthals began their final disappearance. Hold all of it together now, because this is the moment the old story can no longer stand. The replacement model said the Neanderthals were a separate species that died without joining us, and it leaned on the absence of Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA as proof. But mitochondrial DNA was the one signal fragile enough to be lost while the truth survived elsewhere. The full genome remembered the mixing. The functional genes proved it was real and consequential. The Nobel Prize marked the field's complete reversal. And then the ancient genomes from Ranis and Zlati-Kun, with their long, undigested Neanderthal segments, fixed the encounter in time to a single shared pulse around 47,000 years ago that lasted some 7,000 years. The skeptics of 1997 were not foolish. They were working with a flashlight in a vast, dark room, and the small patch they could see genuinely looked empty. They simply mistook the limits of their instrument for the limits of the truth. It is right to be careful about what remains debated. The precise dates still carry uncertainty, and researchers continue to argue over finer details, including evidence for older, smaller episodes of contact between the two groups going back much further in time. But notice what is no longer in question. Whether it happened is settled. That modern humans and Neanderthals had children together, that those children's descendants are most of humanity, that a measurable part of billions of living genomes is Neanderthal, none of that is the uncertain part anymore. The only arguments left are about the exact shape of an encounter whose reality is now beyond serious dispute. The wall is down. What remains is mapping where the door stood. Which brings us back to that stretch of genetic code inside your body that came from someone who died 50,000 years ago. For most of the last century, the story of our origins was a story of solitude, a single species rising alone and inheriting an empty world. We now know the world was never empty, that our ancestors met other kinds of people, lived alongside them, loved among them, and carried their genes forward into nearly every human population outside Africa. The old story was not a lie. It was too small, written by people who had only a flashlight when the room required floodlights. The Neanderthals did not lose and vanish. They joined us, and they are still here, in the immune cells fighting infection, in the genes that shaped how our ancestors survived a frozen continent, in the quiet evidence carried in the blood of most of the people on Earth. We were never the last ones standing. We were the ones who carried everyone else forward. Once you see the evidence, the old story never looks the same again. Subscribe to History Rewritten, because the past is not gone. It is waiting to be re-examined.